Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Let us talk to Des Collins, Senior Partner of Collins Solicitors. It's World AIDS Day today, and some of you may have forgotten or may never have known about one of the biggest sort of health scandals that happened in this country a very, very long time ago, back in the 80s, when something called Factor 8 was a blood product which was sold basically from the United States of America into Britain, and it was used as an anti-clotting factor. But unfortunately for the poor people who were in receipt of it, what they didn't know was that the donors who were being used in the United States, many of them were drug addicts, many of them were homeless. Some of them, of course, had the AIDS virus and passed the AIDS virus on to many people as a result in this country. And it's still a scandal that's still going on. There's an inquiry which is going on, which is due to continue until next year. Let's talk to Des now and find out where all of that is. Des, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. I mean, I suppose for a lot of people this happened long before they were even aware of themselves or aware of the scandal itself. Tell us a little bit about the background to it.
The background is it all happened in the 80s, largely when you had two things coming on stream at one time. You had AIDS coming on in the early 80s, and almost at the same time the development of factor products, which were there to blood concentrates effectively. Yes. So that if you were a haemophiliac and you bled, then you had to be rushed into hospital and hugely complex procedures going on. So the idea of concentrates was going to be a lifesaver for haemophiliacs. They could pick the stuff up, keep it in the fridge at home. If they had a bleed, then they'd go to the fridge, inject the concentrate, and they were fine. Now that sounded like it was a new world for haemophiliacs, but the blood concentrates had to be collected from a huge blood pool. That blood pool became very, very large almost overnight, and in the States they used to not have voluntary donations, blood donations. It was all coming through paid donations, and that's where the people with AIDS, the people with hepatitis, etc.,
yes,
began to infect the whole blood system, and it wasn't picked up in this country quickly enough.
No, it really wasn't, and I suppose it wasn't picked up in the US either. I was in the US at the time. I remember going to Arthur Ashe's press conference. He was the tennis player who had a blood transfusion while he was having an operation in hospital and contracted AIDS from the blood that was transfused into his body. And I remember it like it was yesterday, and I remember writing stories for the Sunday Times about it as well. But nobody was really screening the candidates that were donating their blood, or rather being paid to donate their blood, at that time either.
No, you're quite right. Not only did it affect the haemophiliac community, it affected the whole blood transfusions, as with Arthur Ashe.
Yes, right.
And you had involved in a minor car accident. Let's say you go into hospital, they give you some blood, all of a sudden you've got AIDS. Right. I mean, it was unprecedented, and the reactions to it were very, very slow, and that's why we're still at the receiving end of it today, and still trying to resolve it. As you say, there's a public inquiry going on as we speak.
And how long has that inquiry been going on?
That inquiry has been going on now. It was set up initially by Theresa May in the 2017. Right. It's actually started hearing evidence from the start of last year. It had heard evidence from much of last year, and then, of course, with COVID, it had to close its doors effectively for about 6 months. But it's back in operation now and is hearing evidence, as we speak. And even though that evidence is having to be held remotely, so that you can't attend, you've got to go online and have the evidence zoomed, as it were. It's still hearing the evidence, and as I say, as we speak this morning, it's hearing evidence regarding what the position was in Scotland. So yes, it's going ahead.
I presume many of those who suffered as a result of this scandal, though, may not be with us anymore.
Well, that's right. I mean, you're talking in the early 80s, so you're talking 40 years ago, and of course, a lot of the people who developed AIDS, HIV, were going to die. I mean, they died very, very quickly, and they very often died leaving families completely bereft, not only emotionally, but financially, and they've had to carry that burden for 40 years, and to some extent, their children have had to carry that burden. I mean, we act for about 1,400 people, and we've taken statements from most of those people. And the tragic thing is that very often you find that the children have suffered almost as much as the parents. So you have a father developing AIDS, dies, and then the child at that time is, let's say, 13, 14, makes a complete mess of his schooling or her schooling, and then looks back when they're 40 or 50 and say, well, in the words of the film, I could have been a contender, but I wasn't, because I was completely thrown off key by the epidemic and the fact that the National Health Service, well, it's the Department of Health actually, didn't recognise and didn't realise what it was doing at the time, and to some extent still fails to do that. And that's why the inquiry is running as we speak.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, there was no suggestion that the NHS knew, the National Health Service knew that the blood products were tainted, but they probably should have done. Is that your position?
Yeah, that's you summed that up very well. Yes, there's no suggestion whatsoever that this was deliberate. But what did happen is that as it came on stream, as the knowledge developed very, very quickly. I mean, if you were around at the development in the early 80s, the AIDS came out of the blue like a thunderbolt. I mean, one moment no one had heard of it, and then the next moment it was all over the television. And the Department of Health didn't react sufficiently quickly to and make sure that the haemophiliac community and people who were going to receive transfusions in the general course of events were properly protected. No, by no means was it deliberate, but we say it was negligent, and that they should have the customer, if you like, deserved better and didn't receive that.
No, and have any of those customers and or victims received any type of compensation to date?
The word compensation is a word which the victims hate being used. I very often get told. No, sorry, I just didn't mean that. I have to school myself never to use the.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. What do they prefer?
What they prefer that they've received ex gratia payments.
Right.
And what they say is an ex gratia payment is a charity. They haven't. There's no one recognised what their position is or paid proper, realistic financial compensation. There have been trusts set up in the past, voluntary trusts, which the government has paid money into, and the victims have been able to take money out of, depending on the views of the trustees at any particular time, but they have to make applications for that money. So you have someone whose life has been ruined by this, and they're now 55, and the fridge breaks down. And they apply to the trust for the money to pay for the fridge, because they can't work, because they haven't been, for obvious reasons. Right. They can't work, they need a new fridge. They apply to the trust, and the trust is saying, well, go and get 6 different quotes for fridges and come back to us in 3 months' time, and then we'll look at it once we have another meeting. And it's that sort of almost inhuman treatment of the victims, which has served to, I suppose, to make sure that they have fought on for 40 years to turn it round.
Yes, it's a terrible, terrible situation, really. So what are you hopeful of when the inquiry finally ends, if it ends hopefully sometime next year?
Well, what we are hopeful for with the inquiry is that it will make recommendations to, and now I use the word as it should be used, to compensate the victims for what has happened to them. There was a similar inquiry set up in Ireland some years ago, and that's what happened in Ireland. The inquiry reported said, no, this shouldn't have happened. It was negligent. It wasn't right. And then the government in Ireland paid a substantial amount of money, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but into a fund, and then you made an application to the fund for that money, but not on an ex gratia basis. You went not with your cap in your hand, you went saying, I have been harmed in the normal course of events. I am now entitled to compensation of this sort of money, and the assessment was made. So that's what we're hoping will happen here, but the inquiry is likely to go on for another year or 18 months, so we've got fair way to go yet.
Yes. Well, it's been a long road. I suppose there's no reason to rush the ending of it either. Des, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Des Collins, Senior Partner at Collins Solicitors there on World AIDS Day, telling us about the terrible tragedy of people who were infected with tainted blood without knowing. And it caused many of them to die because they were haemophiliacs, they got AIDS and they didn't recover because there was no recovery back then. What a terrible, terrible story. And for it still to be going on seems incredible.